Awesome choice. Let's go ahead and get started talking about proteins. Now, proteins are what I like to call the doers of the cell because they do a lot of things, right? We have other biological macromolecules such as carbohydrates, right? Our carbohydrates. And those are known for storing energy and providing structure to the cell. And we also have nucleic acids, like something like this, nucleic acids, and those guys are known for carrying information inside the cell. But proteins are special. Proteins are what actually do everything in the cell. Now, the list of things that proteins do is practically endless. There's a lot. But if we wanted to lump their function into 7 main categories, those would likely be reaction facilitators. If you've ever used the term enzyme, then you've discussed proteins, right? Enzymes are a kind of protein that catalyze or facilitate chemical reactions. They also function in defense, like as in your immune system. They also function in transport. For instance, there are proteins on membranes of cells that help transport ions in or out of the cell. They also provide structural support. Think about collagen, which forms the matrix of your skin, or tendons and ligaments, or the keratin that's in your hair. All those are proteins. We also have motion. For instance, actin and myosin are both protein filaments that allow muscles to move and to function. Then we also have regulation. A good example of that are hormones. Hormones are proteins that function as messengers between cells, and proteins also regulate genes. They regulate a lot of things, right? They can turn genes on or off, genes being the components within DNA. And proteins help regulate the production of more proteins. Pretty crazy, right? And then lastly, we have ion storage. This is a topic that we do not really cover a lot in this course, but proteins are capable of storing ions by binding to them, essentially. So now that we did a very abridged and brief overview of the functions of proteins, let's go ahead and explore the structure of proteins. Pop quiz time. Do you remember what monomers are made of for proteins? So what monomers are proteins made of? Okay, if you need more time, you can go ahead and pause. Otherwise, we're going to move on. So as a review, proteins are polymers made up of amino acid monomers. So let's start with going over amino acids. Amino acids get their name from their structure. They are made up of an amino group, which is basically nitrogen and 2 hydrogens, as well as an acidic carboxyl group. A lot of people also just call this a carboxyl group. Fun fact, actually, if you come across a molecule that ends in the suffix -ine, you're probably looking at an amino acid, such as alanine, or histidine, tyrosine, or lysine. And of course, at the core of all biological molecules, we have carbon. So piecing all of this together, we get something like this, where this core construction here is the same in all amino acids, but what comes off of the carbon here is what makes different amino acids unique. As it turns out, there are actually 20 common amino acids, so 20 different groups that come off of this central carbon. And the different amino acids can come together in different combinations and configurations to form different proteins that have different shapes and different functions. This group that comes off the central carbon that makes each amino acid unique is called an R group, or a side chain. Side chain R group mean the same thing. Think of this kind of like a functional group, but for amino acids. It's what makes each of them unique. For instance, if the R group in an amino acid is a methyl group, right? So CH3, carbon with 3 hydrogens. We have the amino acid alanine. But if the R group were instead a carbon, 2 hydrogens plus a hydroxyl group, then suddenly we have the amino acid serine. Fun fact, the R group actually stands for radical. This is of course a chemistry reference, but I like to think of it as R groups are what make each amino acid super rad or radical because it's what makes them unique. Now, like I said before, there are 20 common amino acids that can come together in different combinations and configurations to form different proteins that have different shapes and different functions. So, how do these amino acids come together to form proteins? They do this through the formation of something called a peptide bond, which is a kind of covalent bond that joins the carboxyl end of one amino acid with the amino group of the next amino acid. Now, I know some of you are hyper observant and noticed that when the peptide bond was formed, it looked like the oxygen from the carboxyl group and the two hydrogens from the amino group suddenly disappeared. Actually, what happened is these two molecules broke off from their respective amino acids and formed water, which is what allows the peptide bond to form. And this is what we call a dehydration reaction. It is because of these peptide bonds that proteins are also often called polypeptides. Again, poly meaning many, and peptide referring to the peptide bonds. Now, something unique to protein structure is that they have levels of structure, and that their shape determines their function. So the shape of the protein is very, very specific. Now, what do I mean by levels of structure? Let's talk about it. Now, the structure of proteins is usually discussed as a hierarchy with 4 separate levels. The bottom level, or the base level, being the primary level, followed by the secondary, then tertiary, and last quaternary. Now, before diving into these different levels of protein structure, to help simplify things, I'm going to start drawing things a bit differently. We know that proteins are made up of our amino acids that are joined together to other amino acids by a peptide bond, right? And we know that the structure of an amino acid is made up with that central carbon, an amino group, an acidic carboxyl group, as well as our R group, of which there can be 20 different kinds of R groups, okay? But to make it easier to draw, so I'm not rewriting this structure over and over and over again for you, aka to make this video a bit shorter, I'm going to let this ball here represent a single amino acid. And I'm going to let a white line like this between two balls, that's going to represent our peptide bond, okay?
All right, and with that, let's go ahead and move on to discussing the different levels of structure in proteins.